We all know what it feels like to be forgotten, to watch others turn away when we need help most. There's something heartbreaking about growing old and invisible in a world that only values youth and strength. In the Viking village of Fjellgard, an old woman named Ragna walks through the market with empty pockets on her birthday. She asks the baker for leftover bread, but he just shrugs and looks away. Behind her stands Stigr the Long-Axe, the most feared warrior in the village. Everyone expects him to walk past like the others. Instead, he steps forward and buys every loaf of bread on the table. Then this giant of a man kneels down and gently places all the bread in her trembling arms. When someone asks why, he says only this: "My mother was hungry on her last birthday." But what happened to his mother that changed this fierce warrior forever? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The fjords of Norway had carved Fjellgard from stone and ice over countless centuries, creating a village that clung to life between towering cliffs and the restless sea. Here, where the midnight sun painted the summer sky in shades of amber and gold, Viking families had thrived for generations on the twin pillars of strength and survival. The wooden longhouses stood like sleeping giants along the shoreline, their dragon-carved beams weathered by salt spray and time, while fishing boats bobbed in the harbour like toys in a giant's bathtub. On this particular midsummer morning, the village stirred to life with the familiar sounds of commerce and community. Merchants hawked their wares in voices that carried across the stone-paved square, while children darted between the market stalls like minnows through kelp. The air itself seemed alive with possibility, thick with the scents of fresh fish, baking bread, and the wild flowers that bloomed briefly in these northern latitudes. But if you knew where to look, and most villagers had learned not to, you could spot the figure that cast the longest shadow in Fjellgard, despite rarely standing in direct sunlight. Stigr Eriksson, known throughout the region as Stigr the Long-Axe, moved through the village like a storm cloud on an otherwise clear day. He stood nearly 7 feet tall, his broad shoulders filling doorways, and his presence clearing paths wherever he walked. His hair, the color of winter wheat, hung in thick braids past his shoulders, while his beard, streaked with premature grey, despite his 35 years, fell nearly to his chest. But it was his eyes that truly marked him as dangerous. Pale blue like Arctic ice, they seemed to see everything while revealing nothing. The massive battle-axe that gave him his name rode across his back with casual ease, its iron head bearing the nicks and stains of countless conflicts. The weapon had been forged by his own father, Eriksson the Bold, in the days when Viking raiders still sailed to distant shores seeking glory and gold. Now it served a different purpose, a reminder to all who saw it that some men were born for violence, and Stigr was undoubtedly one of them. As he made his way through the market square that morning, conversations died in his wake like candle flames snuffed by a cold wind. Merchants who had been loudly proclaiming their wares suddenly found urgent business arranging their displays. Children who had been laughing and playing moments before seemed to remember pressing errands elsewhere. Even the dogs that normally begged for scraps from the food stalls slunk away with their tails tucked low. This was the power that Stig wielded without effort or intention, the ability to command fear simply by existing. It was a power that had served him well in the dozen years since he'd returned from his last raiding voyage, a power that kept the peace in Fjellgard through the simple understanding that no one wanted to test the limits of his patience. Yet for all his fearsome reputation, those few who dared to watch Stigr closely might have noticed something curious about his daily routine. He purchased his bread from Gunnar, the baker, with coins counted out precisely, never haggling or demanding special consideration. He nodded respectfully to Astrid the healer when their paths crossed, though she was one of the few villagers who didn't shrink from his presence, and twice each week he could be seen at Bjorn's smithy, not for weapons maintenance, but helping the older man lift heavy pieces when his aging back protested. These small courtesies went largely unnoticed, overshadowed by the stories that followed Stigr like loyal hounds. Tales of the battle where he'd held off 20 Danish raiders single-handed while wounded villagers escaped behind him. The winter he'd tracked down the wolves that had been taking livestock, returning 3 days later with enough pelts to keep the village warm, and no explanation of how he'd managed it alone. The summer when merchants from the south had tried to cheat the village on grain prices, only to find themselves negotiating more fairly after a brief private conversation with the Long-Axe. But these were stories of necessary violence, protection rather than conquest. The truth, known only to Stigr himself, was that he hadn't lifted his axe in anger for over 5 years. The truth was that the most feared man in Fjellgard spent his evenings carving small wooden toys that he left anonymously for the village children, and his nights staring at the stars and wondering what his mother would think of the man he'd become. Astrid, Sigurdsdottir, had known Stigr since childhood, and she alone among the villagers could read the signs that others missed. At 52, she had lived through enough seasons to understand that the loudest storms often hid the gentlest hearts, and that the strongest men were frequently the most wounded. Her healing practice had taught her to look beyond surfaces, to see the pain that people carried in the set of their shoulders or the way they held their hands. When she watched Stigr move through the market that morning, she saw not the terrifying warrior of village legend, but a man carrying a burden too heavy for even his broad shoulders. She saw the way he unconsciously avoided looking toward the small section where the poorest villagers sold their meager wares, and how his steps always slowed when he passed the corner where the elderly gathered to share news and companionship. Bjorn Ironsson, despite his advancing years and aching joints, remained the finest blacksmith in 3 villages. His forge had shaped the tools that built Fjellgard, and his steady hammer had rung out the rhythm of village life for more than 4 decades. He remembered Stigr as a boy, bright, eager, quick to smile, and utterly devoted to his mother, Sigrid. The transformation had begun when Stigr was 15 and joined his first raiding party. He'd returned months later, taller, stronger, and somehow diminished. The boy who had once helped elderly neighbors with their chores now walked past them without seeming to see their struggles. The youth who had carved flowers into fence posts for his mother's garden now carried himself like a weapon waiting to be drawn. But Bjorn was a patient man who understood that iron needed time and heat to find its proper shape. When Stigr began appearing at his smithy 2 years ago, offering help without being asked, Bjorn had simply nodded and handed him an apron. They worked together in comfortable silence most days, the rhythm of hammer on anvil, speaking a language older than words. Eric Bloodaxe, no relation to the legendary king, despite his efforts to suggest otherwise, ruled Fjellgard as Jarl with an iron fist wrapped in a silk glove. At 45, he had never seen true battle, but he understood power and how to maintain it. He ruled through fear, manipulation, and careful attention to ancient traditions that supported his authority while conveniently ignoring those that didn't. Eric viewed Stigr as both his greatest asset and his most dangerous potential rival. The warrior's reputation kept neighboring villages respectful and potential threats at bay, but his independence made Eric nervous. A man who commanded fear without seeking power was unpredictable, and unpredictable men made poor subjects. Still, as long as Stigr remained content to live on the margins of village life, threatening no one and asking for nothing, Eric was willing to leave him alone. It was an arrangement that had worked well for years until this morning, when everything changed with a simple act of unexpected kindness. At the far edge of the village, where the smaller houses gave way to garden plots and grazing land, stood a cottage that most villagers passed without a second glance. It was here that Ragna lived alone, tending a small garden that barely fed her and taking in mending work when her arthritic hands allowed. Ragna had been beautiful once, in the way that northern women could be tall and strong, with hair like spun gold and eyes the color of summer skies. She had married for love rather than advantage, choosing Tor the carpenter over wealthier suitors, and for 20 good years they had been happy. They had tried for children, prayed for them, grieved for the ones that never came, and finally made peace with growing old together instead of watching little ones grow up. Then the fever had taken Torre 3 winters ago, quick and merciless, leaving Ragna with memories, an empty cottage, and very little else. The village had helped initially, as was proper, but help had a way of fading when the crisis passed and people returned to their own concerns. Now, at 68, she lived on the edges of village life, grateful for small kindnesses and too proud to ask for more than she absolutely needed. Today was different, though. Today marked her 70th birthday, though she had told no one and expected no one to remember. But something about the golden morning light and the warmth of the midsummer sun had filled her with an uncharacteristic optimism. Perhaps the baker would have day-old bread he couldn't sell. Perhaps someone would need mending work that could pay for a proper meal. Perhaps, just this once, the world would remember that she existed. She had dressed carefully in her best remaining dress, faded blue wool that had once matched her eyes, and pinned her silver hair back with the bone comb Tor had carved for their first anniversary. The walk to the market square took longer than it once had, but she refused to use the walking stick Astrid had offered. A woman could maintain her dignity even when her body betrayed her. The market was bustling when she arrived, full of the cheerful chaos that marked festival days and prosperous times. She moved slowly through the crowd, invisible to most, until she reached Gunnar's bakery stall. The smell of fresh bread made her stomach clench with longing, but she approached with the careful pride of someone who had learned to ask for charity without losing her soul. "Any leftovers for my birthday?" she had asked, the words barely above a whisper. And then, in a moment that would echo through the village for years to come, Stigr the Long-Axe had stepped forward and changed everything. The bread lay heavy in Ragna's arms as she made her way home, each loaf a small miracle she could barely comprehend. The weight of Stigr's unexpected kindness pressed against her chest more than the actual burden she carried. Behind her, the market continued its daily dance, but she could feel the whispered conversations following in her wake like ripples on a still pond. By the time she reached her cottage, the enormity of what had happened began to settle in her mind. She set the bread carefully on her small wooden table, more food than she'd seen in her home for months, and sank into her chair by the window. Her hands trembled as she touched each loaf, as if they might disappear if she didn't handle them gently enough. The sun was beginning its slow descent when she heard the heavy footsteps approaching her door. She knew immediately who it was. There was only one person in Fjellgard whose walk carried such weight. When the knock came, soft and almost hesitant, she rose carefully and opened the door to find Stigr standing on her threshold, looking somehow smaller than he had in the market square. "I wanted to make sure," he began, then stopped, his pale eyes taking in the neat cottage with its carefully tended garden. "That is, I wondered if you needed anything else." Ragna stepped aside, gesturing him in with a grace that spoke of better times. "Please come. I was just preparing tea." The cottage seemed to shrink around his massive frame, but he moved carefully, respectfully, avoiding her few precious possessions. As she prepared the tea with hands that had steadied since his arrival, Ragna found herself studying this legendary figure in her humble home. Without his axe and away from the fearful gazes of the village, he seemed less like a weapon and more like a man carrying invisible wounds. "You didn't have to do what you did today," she said quietly, setting a steaming cup before him. "But I'm grateful beyond words." Stigr wrapped his large hands around the small cup as if it were something precious. "My mother used to say that we're all just one bad harvest away from needing kindness ourselves." Something in his voice, a careful distance, as if the memory were wrapped in cloth to keep it from cutting, made Ragna lean forward. "Tell me about her. For a long moment, the only sound was the gentle whistle of wind through the eaves. Then, slowly, Stigr began to speak of Sigrid Eriksdottir, the woman who had raised him alone after his father died in a skirmish with Danish raiders. He spoke of her strength, her gentle wisdom, her way of making their small home feel like a fortress against the world's cruelties. As he talked, Ragna rose to clear away the tea things, moving with the careful economy of someone who had learned to waste nothing. It was then that disaster struck in the form of clumsiness born of emotion. Her elbow caught the edge of her sewing basket, sending its contents scattering across the floor. "Oh, forgive me," she gasped, dropping to her knees to gather the scattered threads and needles. Stigr immediately knelt to help, his massive hands surprisingly gentle as he collected the spilled items. It was his hand that closed around the bronze disc first. Ragna's sharp intake of breath made him look up, and he saw her face go pale as fresh snow. In his palm lay a war medal, bronze turned green with age, carved with the raven of the northern clans, and bearing a name etched in runic script, Tor Magnusson. "Where did you get this?" Stigr's voice had gone very quiet. Ragna's hand fluttered to her throat. "It was my husband's. He served under Jarl Magnus the Red in the campaign against the Danes 15 years ago." Stigr's voice carried a strange weight. "I know this medal. I know this name." The silence that followed felt fragile, like ice forming over deep water. Ragna watched as Stigr turned the medal over in his palm, his expression shifting from recognition to something deeper, more complex. "My father gave his life saving this man," Stigr said finally. "Tor the carpenter, he was pinned under a fallen horse when the Danish cavalry charged. My father, Eriksson the Bold, fought his way through 5 enemy warriors to reach him. He got Tore free, but took a spear through the heart, doing it." Ragna's hand covered her mouth. "You're Eriksson's son, but that means that I owe my father's final act to your husband's life." "Yes." Stigr set the medal gently on the table between them. "Tor returned to tell us what happened. He was the one who brought my father's effects home, who stayed with my mother through the first terrible nights of grief." The weight of this revelation settled over them both like a heavy blanket. Ragna reached across the table and covered Stigr's hand with her own, the first time in years anyone had touched him without fear. "Your father saved the man I loved," she whispered, "and now you've shown kindness to his widow. Perhaps there's a pattern in these things." Stigr looked down at her small hand covering his scarred knuckles. "My mother always believed in such patterns. She said the threads of fate are woven by small acts as much as great ones." "What happened to her?" Ragna asked gently. The pain that crossed Stigr's features was quick but deep, like watching someone flinch from an old wound. "Hunger," he said simply. "The winter I was away on my last raid, the harvest had failed. She gave her food to the younger children in the village, told everyone she was fine. By the time I returned with my share of the spoils, it was too late." "Oh, my dear boy." Ragna's other hand reached across to cup his bearded cheek. "She would be proud of what you did today." "Would she?" Stigr's voice cracked slightly. "I've spent 10 years being exactly what the village needed me to be. Something to fear, something to keep the wolves at bay. But I forgot what she taught me about being human." As they sat in the growing twilight, sharing stories of the people they'd lost and the choices that had shaped them, neither could have predicted how this simple conversation would ripple outward through their small community. But already, changes were beginning. At Bjorn's forge, the blacksmith was telling his wife about the strange scene he'd witnessed in the market. At the healer's house, Astrid was preparing extra supplies, sensing that someone would need her skills soon, and in the Jarl's hall, Erik was receiving reports of his most valuable enforcer showing unprecedented weakness at exactly the wrong time. The village elders had been discussing the upcoming harvest festival for weeks. It was Fjellgard's most important celebration, a time when the entire community came together to honor the season's bounty and reinforce the social bonds that held them together through the harsh northern winters. Eric had been planning to use this year's festival to announce new laws, restrictions on who could participate in the communal feast, based on traditional values and contributions to the community. It was a thinly veiled way to exclude the village's poorest and most vulnerable residents, those who couldn't pay the increasingly steep taxes or provide useful services to the Jarl's household. But now, with Stigr showing public sympathy for exactly the kind of person Eric wanted to marginalize, the Jarl found himself facing an unexpected problem. How could he implement his plans when the village's most respected warrior had just demonstrated the opposite values? As the evening star appeared over Fjellgard, Ragna walked Stigr to her garden gate. The bronze medal sat heavy in her palm. She had insisted he take it, saying it belonged with Ericsson's son. "Will you come back?" she asked, and was surprised by how much the answer mattered to her. "If you'll have me," Stigr replied. "I find I've been alone with my thoughts long enough." As he walked away into the gathering dusk, Ragna stood watching until his tall figure disappeared among the shadows. She didn't yet know that her simple question about leftover bread had set in motion forces that would transform not just their own lives, but the very soul of their village. The threads of fate, as Stigr's mother had once said, were indeed woven by small acts, and tonight those threads were beginning to form a pattern that no one could have predicted. 3 days after the incident at the market, Stigr found himself walking the familiar path to Ragna's cottage with a small sack of grain and dried fish. It had become a routine he hadn't planned, bringing supplies, sharing conversation, and finding in her company a peace he'd forgotten existed. The village watched these visits with growing curiosity, whispers following him like shadows wherever he went. "The Long-Axe has found himself a grandmother," he heard Gunnar mutter to another merchant as he passed the bakery. The words stung, not because they were meant as insult, but because they held a truth he wasn't ready to examine. Ragna greeted him at her door with the same gentle warmth she'd shown since that first evening. Her cottage had become a sanctuary where he could set down the weight of his reputation and simply exist as a man, sharing tea and stories with someone who saw past the legend to the person beneath. Today, however, something was different in her manner. As she prepared their usual afternoon tea, her movements carried a careful deliberation that spoke of difficult thoughts being wrestled into order. "I've been thinking about what you told me," she said finally, settling across from him with her steaming cup. "About your mother." Stigr's hands tightened around his own cup. He had shared more with Ragna in 3 days than he had with anyone in 10 years, but some memories remained too raw to touch easily. "You said she gave her food to the village children during that harsh winter," Ragna continued gently. "That's how she was always putting others first." "Always," Stigr agreed, his voice barely above a whisper. "Even when I was small, if a neighbor's family was struggling, she'd find reasons to invite their children for meals. Said it was practice for when she'd have a house full of her own grandchildren." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that would never be fulfilled. Ragna reached across the table and touched his hand. "Tell me about that last winter. You need to say it out loud." For a long moment, Stigr stared into his tea as if it might hold answers to questions he'd been avoiding. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of 10 years' worth of buried guilt. "I had been planning to stay home that season. The raiding life was starting to wear thin, and she needed help with the cottage repairs before the snow came." He paused, his thumb tracing the handle of his cup. But then Jarl Olaf, from the eastern settlements, came recruiting for one last profitable venture before winter. The chance to return with enough silver to keep us comfortable for years. Ragna nodded encouragingly, recognizing the careful way he was approaching the heart of his pain. "She insisted I go, said she'd managed fine before I was born, and she could manage a few months while I was away. Made me promise to take the opportunity." Stigr's voice grew rougher. I knew the harvest had been poor, but she kept saying the village would look out for each other the way it always had. He stood abruptly, moving to the window that looked out over Ragna's small garden. The late afternoon light caught the silver in his hair, making him look older than his 35 years. When I returned 3 months later, loaded down with silver and fine goods, I found her in her bed, weighing barely more than a child. The neighbors said she'd been giving away her food rations, claiming she wasn't hungry. They believed her because she'd always been strong. Ragna's eyes filled with understanding. And you blamed yourself for not being there to stop her. I blamed myself for leaving at all, Stigr said heavily, for choosing silver over staying home, for believing that providing for our future was more important than protecting her present. Is that when you stopped raiding? Stigr nodded. I buried her with my father's war ring and swore I'd never again choose distant gold over the people who needed me here and now. He turned back to face her. But somewhere in my grief, I also swore I'd never care enough about anyone to feel that kind of loss again. Ragna rose and joined him at the window, her presence a comfort without being an intrusion. Until 3 days ago, he confirmed, when I heard you ask for birthday bread and saw how easily the world was prepared to let you go hungry. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the evening light paint the garden in shades of gold and amber. Finally, Ragna spoke. Your mother's wooden comb, do you still have it? Stigr's hand moved unconsciously to the leather pouch at his belt. Always. It's the only thing of hers I kept. May I see it? With hands that trembled slightly, Stigr withdrew a small wooden comb, its surface worn smooth by decades of use. The craftsmanship was simple but elegant, carved from what looked like birchwood and polished to a warm honey color. Ragna accepted it reverently, running her fingers over the gentle curves. She used this every morning? Every morning and every evening. She said a woman's hair was her crown, and a crown deserved proper care. Stigr's voice carried the echo of old affection. She used to comb mine too when I was very young. Said it helped her think. What would she think now, watching you bring food to an old woman who reminds you of her? The question hung between them like a bridge, waiting to be crossed. Stigr considered it seriously, his pale eyes distant with memory. She'd say I was finally learning the difference between strength that protects and strength that isolates, he said slowly. She always believed that the strongest people were those who used their power to lift others up. As if summoned by their conversation, footsteps approached the cottage. Both Stigr and Ragna turned toward the sound, recognizing the lighter tread of someone moving with purpose but without threat. Astrid the healer appeared around the corner of the cottage, her leather satchel slung over her shoulder and her expression carrying the particular mix of determination and concern that marked her professional visits. Ragna, I've brought those herbs I promised for your joints, she called, then stopped short when she saw Stigr at the window. Oh, forgive me, I didn't realize you had company. But instead of the fear or unease that usually greeted Stigr's presence, Astrid's face showed only mild surprise and what might have been approval. Please, come in, Ragna said, moving toward the door. Stigr was just telling me about his mother. Astrid stepped inside, her experienced eyes taking in the domestic scene, the teacups, the comfortable atmosphere, the way both occupants seemed more at peace than she'd seen either of them in years. Sigrid was a good woman, Astrid said simply, addressing Stigr directly. I treated her during that last winter. She made me promise not to tell you how bad things had gotten. The words hit Stigr like a physical blow. You knew? I suspected. But she was proud, and she was convinced you'd abandon your obligations to rush home before you'd secured the resources she wanted you to have. Astrid's voice held no judgment, only the weary understanding of someone who had seen too much human suffering. She died believing she'd given you the gift of success. Stigr sank back into his chair, the wooden comb still clutched in his hand. The revelation that others had known of his mother's sacrifice while he remained ignorant added another layer to his grief and his guilt. But as Ragna returned to her seat beside him and Astrid began unpacking her healing herbs, something unexpected began to happen. For the first time in 10 years, Stigr found himself in the company of people who knew his pain and didn't turn away from it. The village might whisper about his strange new habits, but in this small cottage, surrounded by the simple rituals of care and conversation, he began to remember what it felt like to be human. The following evening found Stigr once again at Ragna's door, this time carrying wood for her fire and a small pot of honey he'd traded for at the market. It was becoming clear to both of them that these visits had evolved beyond simple charity into something resembling friendship, a concept that sat strangely with a man who had spent a decade in self-imposed isolation. As they settled into their usual chairs by the hearth, Ragna pulled out a piece of handwork that immediately caught Stigr's attention. It was a blanket, partially completed, woven in soft blues and greens with an intricate pattern that spoke of countless hours of careful labor. "It's beautiful," he said, watching her nimble fingers work despite the arthritis that made her movements careful and deliberate. "Who is it for?" Ragna's hands stilled for a moment, and a shadow of old sorrow crossed her features. "No one anymore," she said quietly. "I started it 20 years ago, when Tor and I still believed we might have children. I've added to it over the years, a few rows here and there, when the loneliness felt too heavy." Stigr leaned forward, studying the intricate pattern more closely. "It's large enough for a child's bed, or to wrap an old woman's shoulders on cold nights," Ragna said with a gentle smile that didn't quite hide the deeper sadness. "Tor used to say I was weaving dreams into the threads. Now I suppose I'm weaving memories instead." The quiet honesty of her words settled between them like a shared understanding. Both had learned to carry losses that shaped the rhythm of their days. Both had found ways to honor what was gone while continuing to live. "Tell me about him," Stigr said. "About Tor." Ragna's face brightened, the way it always did when she spoke of her late husband. "He was nothing like what you might expect a carpenter to be, gentle where others were rough, thoughtful where others were quick to act. He could look at a piece of wood and see what it wanted to become, rather than forcing it into shapes it wasn't meant to hold." She continued working as she talked, her fingers finding their rhythm in the familiar motions. "We met at a harvest festival, much like the one coming up next week. He was helping to build the temporary tables, and I was helping to prepare the food. I spilled berry juice on a dress I'd spent weeks making, and instead of laughing like the other young men, he quietly offered to fix the stain with something he'd learned from his mother. Did he succeed? Oh, yes. But more than that, he sat with me while the stain soaked out, asking questions about the dye I'd used and the pattern I'd woven. Most men saw domestic work as women's mystery, but Tore was genuinely curious about how things were made, how they worked. Ragna paused in her weaving, lost in the memory. "I think I fell in love with him that night, watching him concentrate on saving a dress that mattered to me." Stigr found himself smiling at the image. "He sounds like a man worth loving." He was. And when the fever took him, he made me promise not to spend my remaining years mourning what we couldn't have, instead of celebrating what we did. Her voice grew firm. "That's why I keep weaving this blanket. Not because I'm waiting for children who will never come, but because the act of creating something beautiful matters, even if only I will see it completed." As if summoned by the mention of creation, a soft knock came at the door. Ragna rose to answer it, revealing young Helga Bjornsdotter, the blacksmith's daughter, standing nervously on the threshold with a bundle in her arms. "Forgive the intrusion," Helga said, her eyes widening when she spotted Stigr in the firelight. "Of course, dear. Come in, come in." Ragna ushered the young woman inside, her natural hospitality overcoming any awkwardness about Stigr's presence. "What do you have there?" Helga unwrapped her bundle to reveal a wedding dress, beautiful but damaged. A long tear ran down one side, and several of the decorative embroideries had come loose. "It was my grandmother's," Helga explained, her voice catching slightly. "I'm to be married next month, and I'd hoped to wear it, but—" She gestured helplessly at the damage. Ragna accepted the dress with the reverence it deserved, examining the tear and loose threads with a practiced eye. "This is fine work. The embroidery is some of the best I've seen. It can definitely be repaired." "But the cost," Helga began, "will be whatever you can afford," Ragna said firmly. "A woman should wear her grandmother's love on her wedding day, regardless of her purse." Stigr watched this exchange with growing interest. He had seen kindness before, but there was something about the way Ragna approached it, not as charity that elevated the giver, but as simple recognition that people deserved care simply because they were people. "I could help with the cost," he found himself saying, surprising everyone, including himself, "if it would make the difference." Helga's eyes went wide with shock. The idea of the Long-Axe concerning himself with wedding dress repairs was so far outside anyone's expectations that for a moment no one knew how to respond. "That's very generous," Ragnar said carefully, "but perhaps unnecessary. I'm sure we can work something out." But Stig was remembering his mother's stories about her own wedding dress, passed down through 3 generations before being lost in a fire. "A bride should have something beautiful," he said simply, "something that connects her to the women who came before." Word of the Long-Axe's involvement in wedding dress economics spread through Fjellgard faster than smoke on the wind. By the next morning, half the village knew that their most feared warrior had offered to help pay for young Helga's repairs, and the other half had heard increasingly elaborate versions involving everything from secret romantic interests to elaborate schemes for community domination. The reality, as Bjorn discovered when he stopped by Stigr's home that evening, was both simpler and more complex than the rumors suggested. "So you're getting involved in village life now?" the blacksmith asked, settling onto Stigr's simple wooden bench with a grunt of satisfaction. "I'm helping an old woman who reminds me of my mother," Stigr replied. "Everything else just seems to follow from that." Bjorn nodded thoughtfully. He had watched Stig's transformation over the past week with the interest of someone who had known him since childhood. "Your mother would be pleased, would she? Sometimes I think she'd be disappointed that it took me so long to remember what she taught me." "Sigrid was many things, but never one to waste time on regret," Bjorn said firmly. "She'd be more interested in what you do next than in what you failed to do before." As they sat together in the gathering dusk, watching the village settle into evening routines, both men could sense changes coming that went beyond simple acts of kindness. The harvest festival was only days away, and with it would come decisions that would shape Fjellgard's future in ways neither could yet imagine. But tonight, it was enough to know that old friendships could be rekindled, that isolated hearts could learn to open again, and that sometimes the smallest acts of compassion could ripple outward in directions no one expected. The preparations for the harvest festival had begun in earnest, and with them came the annual ritual of decisions that would determine who belonged and who would be left outside the circle of community celebration. Eric Bloodaxe stood in his hall, examining the large iron key that controlled access to the village's communal food stores, a key that had become both symbol and instrument of his authority. For 3 years running, Eric had used the festival as an opportunity to tighten his control over Fjellgard's social order. Each year, the criteria for participation became slightly more restrictive, the contributions required slightly more steep, the definitions of worthy community members slightly more narrow. It was a gradual process, designed to avoid open rebellion while steadily consolidating power among those who served his interests. This year, he had planned the most ambitious restrictions yet. Only those who could prove significant material contributions to the village's welfare would be permitted to join the communal feast. The elderly who could no longer work, the widowed who had no family support, The craftsmen whose skills were no longer in demand, all would find themselves politely but firmly excluded from the celebration that had once embraced every soul in Fjellgard. But Stigr's recent behavior had complicated these plans in ways Eric hadn't anticipated. How could he justify excluding people like Ragna when the village's most respected warrior had publicly demonstrated their worth? How could he maintain that the poor were undeserving when the Long-Axe himself had chosen to champion their cause? The problem, Eric confided to his closest advisor, a thin man named Finn, who specialized in finding legal justifications for whatever Eric wanted to do, is that Stigr's actions have given people ideas about who deserves consideration. Finn nodded knowingly. Perhaps it's time to remind the village that even the strongest men can be led astray by misplaced sentiment. Meanwhile, unaware of the political currents swirling around her simple friendship, Ragna found herself at the center of an unexpected community as word spread about Stigr's regular visits. Other elderly villagers, emboldened by his example, began stopping by her cottage for conversation and companionship. What had started as isolated acts of charity were becoming something larger, a gathering place for those who had been slowly pushed to the margins of village life. "It's the strangest thing," old Henrik the fisherman said, settling his aching bones into a chair by Ragna's fire. "I haven't felt welcome in the village centre for months, but here, talking with you and the others, I remember what community used to feel like." Astrid had become a regular presence as well, bringing her healing skills to those who couldn't afford formal treatment. She found herself treating ailments that had been neglected for months simply because their sufferers couldn't pay the expected fees. "This is how it should be," she told Ragna as she examined Henrik's swollen joints. "Healing shouldn't be a privilege reserved for those with full purses." When Stigr arrived for his usual evening visit, he found Ragna's cottage fuller than he'd ever seen it. 7 elderly villagers sat around her small table and hearth, sharing bread and stories, while Astrid worked quietly in the corner, preparing herbal remedies. The scene should have overwhelmed the small space, but instead it felt warm and alive in a way that made Stigr pause in the doorway. Come in," Ragna called, spotting him. "We were just discussing the festival arrangements, and I thought you might have opinions worth hearing." Stigr entered carefully, nodding respectfully to each person present. To his surprise, instead of the usual fearful silence that greeted his presence, he was met with genuine welcome. These were people who had watched him bring food to their gathering place, who had seen him treat their hostess with kindness and respect. "We were wondering," said Marta, an ancient woman whose husband had died in the same battle as Stigr's father, "whether you knew about Eric's new requirements for festival participation." Stigr frowned. "What requirements?" Henrik shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Word is that this year, only those who can demonstrate significant recent contributions to village prosperity will be welcome at the communal feast. The rest of us are to celebrate separately, or not at all." The iron key to the food stores, Stig realized, had become more than just a practical tool. It was Eric's way of deciding who belonged in Fjellgard's future. The thought of these good people being excluded from their own community's most important celebration struck him with unexpected force. "That's not how the harvest festival has ever worked," he said quietly, but with an edge in his voice that made everyone present sit up straighter. "The feast has always been for everyone who calls Fjellgard home. Traditions change," Astrid said carefully, though her tone suggested she disapproved of this particular change. "Eric claims he's following ancient customs that prioritize those who contribute most to the community's strength." Stigr's hands clenched involuntarily. He had seen enough of the world to recognize the difference between tradition and tyranny, between genuine community standards and arbitrary exercises of power. "What constitutes a significant contribution?" he asked. The uncomfortable silence that followed told him everything he needed to know. The criteria would be whatever Eric needed them to be, flexible enough to include his supporters and exclude anyone he found inconvenient. Perhaps, Ragna said gently, this is something you might discuss with Eric directly. Your voice carries weight in village matters. It was the first time anyone had directly asked Stigr to use his influence for political purposes, and the request settled on him with surprising heaviness. For 10 years, he had deliberately avoided involvement in Fjellgard's governance, content to serve as a deterrent to outside threats while staying clear of internal conflicts. But looking around the cottage at faces that had become familiar, listening to voices that had become valued, he found himself unable to maintain that distance. These weren't abstract principles being debated. These were people he had come to care about being treated as disposable. "I'll speak with him," Stigr said finally. "Tomorrow." The relief in the room was palpable, though Stigr noticed that Astrid looked more worried than comforted by his promise. She alone seemed to understand the larger implications of what was happening, that a man who had spent a decade avoiding political entanglement was about to step directly into the center of a conflict that could reshape the entire village. As the evening wound down and the small gathering dispersed to their various homes, Ragna walked with Stigr to her garden gate under a sky brilliant with stars. "Are you certain about confronting Eric?" she asked. "You've built a peaceful life here by staying out of such matters." Stigr looked back at the cottage, still warm with lamplight and the echoes of genuine community. "Some things matter more than peace," he said quietly. "My mother used to say that standing aside while good people suffer isn't neutrality, it's just another form of choosing sides." As he walked home through the quiet village, Stigr carried with him the weight of a decision that would end his decade of isolation forever. Tomorrow, he would remind Eric Bloodaxe that true strength came from protecting the vulnerable, not from exploiting them. Whatever consequences followed, he could no longer pretend that other people's suffering was none of his concern. The ancient law stone stood in the center of Eric's hall like a monument to unchanging authority. Carved from black granite and older than anyone could remember, its surface bore runic inscriptions that had governed Viking communities for generations. Eric ran his fingers over the weathered symbols as he prepared for what he knew would be a difficult conversation with Stigr. When the Long-Axe arrived at midday, his presence seemed to fill the hall despite his deliberate calm. Eric gestured toward the stone tablet with the confidence of a man who had spent years studying how to use tradition as a weapon. "I understand you have concerns about the festival arrangements," Eric said without preamble. "I thought you might benefit from understanding the legal foundations for my decisions." Stigr approached the law stone, his pale eyes scanning the ancient runes with the careful attention of someone who could actually read them, a skill Eric had assumed the warrior lacked. "These are interesting laws," Stigr said quietly, his finger tracing one particular passage. "This section here speaks of the duty to protect the defenseless, and this one about sharing resources during times of plenty." Eric's confidence faltered slightly. "Those are metaphorical provisions, meant for times of genuine crisis, not routine community management." "Are they?" Stigr's voice carried a dangerous edge. "Because this rune here specifically mentions harvest celebrations, and it says that all who dwell under the protection of the community should share in its abundance." The silence that followed was heavy with implications. Eric had spent years selectively quoting from the law stone, confident that most villagers couldn't read the ancient script well enough to challenge his interpretations. Finding himself facing someone who could not only read the laws but understood their original intent left him scrambling for new ground. "Laws must be interpreted in the context of current realities," Eric said, his voice taking on the lecturing tone he used when he felt his authority questioned. "We live in different times than those who carved these stones. The village has limited resources, and we must be practical about their distribution." Stigr stepped back from the lawstone, his expression thoughtful but resolved. "Limited resources. Tell me, Eric, have the harvest yields been poor this year?" "Well, no, but are the village food stores unusually depleted?" "Not exactly depleted, but we must plan for. Are we facing any immediate threats that require us to conserve supplies for defense?" Eric's jaw tightened. "Stigr, You're oversimplifying complex administrative realities. Leadership requires making difficult choices that preserve the community's long-term stability. Leadership, Stigr repeated the word, as if testing its weight. I've been thinking about that concept lately, about what my father would have understood leadership to mean. He turned to face Eric directly, and the Jarl was reminded forcefully of why this man's presence had always made him nervous. There was something in Stigr's pale eyes that suggested depths of resolve that could be dangerous if properly motivated. My father died protecting a man some might have considered expendable, a carpenter with no great wealth or political influence. But Eriksson the Bold understood that a community's strength isn't measured by how well it serves its most powerful members, but by how carefully it protects its most vulnerable ones. Pretty sentiment, Eric replied, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. But sentiment doesn't govern communities effectively. We must be practical. Practical. Stigr seemed to consider the word. Like excluding elderly villagers who've spent their entire lives contributing to Fjellgard's prosperity. Like denying festival participation to people whose only crime is growing old or being widowed. Eric moved behind the law stone, using its bulk as a barrier between himself and Stigr's growing intensity. Those people are welcome to celebrate in their own ways, in their own spaces. The communal feast is for those who actively contribute to current community welfare. And who decides what constitutes active contribution? Stig's voice had grown very quiet, a warning sign that Eric was too agitated to properly recognize. You? Based on what criteria? Their ability to pay fees you've arbitrarily established? The conversation was spiraling beyond Eric's control, moving into territory where his carefully constructed justifications couldn't protect him from the fundamental cruelty of his policies. He fell back on his final line of defense, the authority of his position. I am Jarl of this village, appointed by the regional king and confirmed by the village elders. These decisions are mine to make, and questioning them publicly undermines the stability that keeps us all safe. Stigr was silent for a long moment, studying Eric with the same careful attention he had given to the lawstone. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of a man who had finally reached the end of his patience. You're right that these decisions are yours to make, but you're wrong if you think that makes them unquestionable. He stepped closer to the lawstone, placing his hand flat against its ancient surface. This stone speaks of justice, protection, and community obligation. The laws our ancestors carved here were meant to bind leaders as much as they bound anyone else. Eric felt sweat gathering at his temples despite the cool air in the hall. Are you threatening me, Stigr? I'm reminding you that authority without justice is just organized cruelty, Stigr replied. And I'm informing you that I intend to challenge your festival restrictions publicly before the entire village. You can't do that. You have no official standing, no legal authority to... I have the authority of someone who's spent 10 years protecting this village without asking for anything in return. Stigr interrupted. I have the authority of someone whose family has bled and died for Fjellgard's welfare. And I have the authority of someone who understands what these laws actually say, rather than what you've twisted them to mean. Eric's face had gone pale, but his voice maintained its challenging edge. If you oppose me publicly, you'll be forcing the village to choose between us. Are you prepared for those consequences? Stigr considered the question seriously. Are you? As he turned to leave, Stigr paused at the threshold of the hall. The festival is 3 days away, Eric. That gives you time to reconsider your restrictions. I hope you'll choose to remember what leadership actually means. After he left, Eric stood alone with the law stone, its ancient runes seeming to mock his careful schemes for control. For the first time since becoming Jarl, he faced the possibility that his authority might not be as absolute as he'd believed. Outside, Stigr walked through the village with the measured pace of someone who had just committed himself to a course of action that would change everything. There would be no more standing aside, no more neutral ground between justice and convenience. The threads of fate, as his mother had once said, were indeed woven by individual choices, and today he had chosen to remember who he was meant to be. The bundle of letters lay hidden beneath Ragna's mattress like secrets waiting to escape into daylight. She had kept them there for 3 years, bound with a faded ribbon and wrapped in oiled cloth to protect them from dampness and time. Today, as she prepared tea for Stigr's visit, her hand brushed against the concealed packet, and she made a decision that would change everything. When Stigr arrived, his expression still carrying the tension from his confrontation with Eric, he found Ragna sitting by her window with the letters spread across her lap like fallen leaves. The afternoon light caught the official seals and careful script, revealing documents that clearly bore the mark of noble correspondence. "What are those?" he asked, settling into his usual chair, but keeping his eyes fixed on the papers with growing curiosity. Ragna's hands trembled slightly as she smoothed the topmost letter. "My past, finally catching up with me." She looked up at him with eyes that held both sadness and something that might have been relief. "I haven't been entirely honest with you about who I am, Stigr. Or rather, who I was before I became the woman you know." She lifted the first letter, its parchment bearing a seal that made Stigr's eyes widen with recognition, the raven and crossed axes of Jarl Magnus Thorson, ruler of the eastern settlements and one of the most powerful nobles in the region. "Magnus Thorson is my brother," she said simply, letting the weight of that revelation settle between them like a stone dropped into still water. Stigr stared at her, his mind reeling as everything he thought he knew about Ragna's situation shifted into new patterns. "Your brother? But that would make you Lady Ragna Thorsdottir. Yes, born to wealth and position, raised to marry advantageously and strengthen political alliances." Her voice carried no pride in the titles, only the weariness of someone who had long ago left such things behind. "I was meant to wed Earl Bjorn of the Northern Territories, a match that would have unified 2 of the largest Viking holdings in Norway." She set the letter aside and picked up another, this one bearing a more recent date. "Instead, I fell in love with a carpenter's son and chose happiness over duty. My family was not pleased." Stigr leaned forward, fascination and concern warring in his expression. "What happened?" "I was cast out, disowned, stripped of title, inheritance, and family name." Ragna's voice remained steady, but her hands shook slightly as she handled the letters. "Magnus declared me dead to the family, rather than acknowledge that his sister had chosen love over political advantage." The silence that followed was heavy with implications. Stigr found himself looking at Ragna with new eyes, seeing beneath her humble circumstances to the bearing and quiet dignity that suddenly made perfect sense. She had been raised in halls like Eric's, educated in the complexities of leadership and politics, trained to navigate the dangerous currents of noble society. "Why are you telling me this now?" he asked, gently. Ragna picked up the most recent letter, dated only 2 weeks earlier. "Because Magnus is dying. Cancer, according to his physicians, and according to this letter, he wants to see me before the end." She handed him the parchment, and Stig read it with growing amazement. The letter was formal in structure but desperate in tone, a proud man swallowing decades of rigid principle to reach out to the sister he had publicly disavowed. "He has no heir," Ragna continued as Stigr read. "His wife died in childbirth years ago, and the baby didn't survive. His holdings will pass to distant cousins who care nothing for the people who depend on his leadership. He wants to restore my inheritance, to give me the chance to choose a worthy successor from among those I trust." The magnitude of what she was describing began to dawn on Stigr. "You're talking about one of the largest territories in Norway, dozens of villages, thousands of people. I'm talking about the chance to ensure that communities like Fjellgard are governed by people who understand that true strength comes from protecting the vulnerable, not exploiting them. Ragna's eyes met his with an intensity he had never seen before. I'm talking about the opportunity to demonstrate what leadership looks like when it serves justice instead of personal ambition. Stigr set the letter down carefully, his warrior's mind already analyzing the political ramifications. Eric doesn't know about this. No one knows. I've been just another poor widow for 3 years, invisible and irrelevant to anyone who cares about power. A slight smile played at the corners of Ragna's mouth. But if word gets out that the forgotten old woman Eric has been systematically excluding from community life is actually the sister of Jarl Magnus Thorson, well, it would destroy his credibility completely, Stigr finished. Not just in Fjellgard, but throughout the region. No one would trust a leader who had shown such poor judgment about who deserved respect and consideration. But even as he spoke, Stigr felt a growing concern. This changes everything, Ragna. If Eric discovers your identity before you're ready to reveal it, he might act desperately. Desperate men make dangerous enemies. Ragna nodded soberly. I know. That's why I need to leave for Magnus's territory soon, before word can spread in ways I can't control. The journey will take days, and I'll need an escort I can trust completely. The request hung in the air between them, unspoken but perfectly clear. Stigr understood that she wasn't just asking for protection on a dangerous journey, she was asking him to step fully into the political arena he had avoided for 10 years, to take sides in conflicts that could reshape the balance of power across multiple territories. There's something else, Ragna continued, reaching for another letter from the bundle. This one arrived yesterday, sent through channels my brother uses for his most sensitive communications. She handed him a second parchment, and as Stig read it, his expression grew increasingly grim. The letter was from one of Magnus's trusted advisors, warning that rival nobles had learned of the dying Jarl's attempts to contact his disowned sister. They were already maneuvering to prevent any reconciliation that might interfere with their plans for claiming his territories after his death. They know you exist, Stigr said quietly, and they know Magnus wants to restore your inheritance, which means they'll be watching for any attempt I make to reach him. The journey, that should be a private family matter, has become a race against political enemies who would prefer to see me disappear permanently. Stigr stood and moved to the window, his mind working through the tactical challenges. Travel through 3 territories controlled by Magnus's rivals, protecting a woman whose identity made her valuable as both ally and target, arriving safely while avoiding the kind of political entanglements that could drag Fjellgard into conflicts far beyond its size. "When do you want to leave?" he asked finally. Ragna's relief was visible. "As soon as possible, but Stigr, I need you to understand what you'd be risking. This isn't just about helping an old friend anymore. You'd be involving yourself in noble politics at the highest levels, making enemies of people with resources and reach far beyond anything Eric can threaten." Stig turned back to face her, and she saw in his pale eyes the same resolve that had made him legendary among warriors. 3 weeks ago, you asked for leftover bread on your birthday. You've taught me that true strength comes from protecting people who matter, regardless of whether they can protect themselves. The fact that you happen to be nobility doesn't change that principle. He moved to collect his axe from where he had left it by the door. "How soon can you be ready to travel?" "By tomorrow evening. But what about your confrontation with Eric over the festival? If you leave now, Eric's festival restrictions will matter a lot less when word spreads that he spent months treating the sister of Jarl Magnus Thorson like a beggar," Stigr said with a slight smile. "Some battles are won by fighting, others by changing the ground they're fought on." As evening settled over Fjellgard, neither Stigr nor Ragna could have predicted how quickly word of their planned departure would spread, or how desperately Eric would act when he realized that his most valuable enforcer was about to vanish at precisely the moment when his authority faced its greatest challenge. The threads of fate were indeed being rewoven, but the pattern they would create remained hidden in the shadows of choices yet to be made. The shield had hung on Stig's wall for 20 years. Its bronze surface, polished to a mirror, shined despite the deep scratches that told the story of its service. Eriksson the Bold had carried it through a dozen battles, and his father before him through a dozen more. Now, as Stigr lifted it down and tested its weight against his arm, he felt the accumulated honor and responsibility of generations settling across his shoulders like a familiar cloak. Word of his intended departure had spread through Fjellgard with the speed that only dangerous secrets could achieve. By dawn, half the village knew that the Long-Axe was preparing for travel, and by midday, speculation about his destination had grown wild enough to include everything from secret military campaigns to mysterious romantic entanglements. Erik, however, had sources that provided more accurate intelligence than village gossip. By evening, he knew that Stigr planned to escort an elderly woman eastward toward Magnus Thorson's territory, and that knowledge filled him with a cold dread that had nothing to do with losing his enforcer and everything to do with losing his carefully constructed position of authority. "You cannot leave now," Erik said, when he arrived at Stigr's cottage uninvited and clearly agitated. "The harvest festival is tomorrow. The village expects your presence." Stigr continued packing supplies into his travel sack without looking up. "The village will manage one festival without me. They have for centuries before I was born. That's not the point, and you know it." Erik stepped closer, his voice taking on the commanding tone he used when he expected immediate obedience. "Your sudden departure, right after our disagreement about festival policies, sends a message to the entire community about whose authority they should respect." Now Stigr did look up, and Erik was reminded why most people avoided meeting those pale blue eyes when their owner was truly angry. "My departure sends exactly the message I intend it to send, that some things matter more than village politics. Such as keeping my word to someone who needs protection." Stigr returned to his packing, his movements deliberate and final. "Such as honoring the memory of my father, who understood that a warrior's greatest duty is to shield those who cannot shield themselves." Erik felt desperation beginning to claw at his composure. Without Stigr's implicit backing, his authority over Fjellgard rested on much shakier ground than he cared to admit. The warrior's reputation had been the invisible foundation of Erik's power for years, the unspoken threat that kept dissent manageable and neighboring villages respectful. "I forbid it," Erik said, the words escaping before he could consider their implications. The silence that followed was so complete that Erik could hear his own heartbeat in his ears. Stigr straightened slowly, his hand moving almost unconsciously toward the axe that leaned against the wall nearby. "You forbid it," Stigr repeated, his voice carrying a dangerous quiet that made Erik take an involuntary step backward. "As Jarl of this village, I have the authority to command the service of all able-bodied warriors during times of potential crisis. Your departure could destabilize." "Erik!" Stig's voice cut through the Jarl's increasingly frantic justifications like a blade through silk. "In 20 years of living in this village, you have never once given me a direct order. Not because you respected my independence, but because you understood that your authority over me was a comfortable fiction that worked only as long as neither of us examined it too closely." Erik's face had gone pale, but pride and desperation drove him to continue pushing against boundaries he should have left untested. "I am the legally appointed ruler of this community. That gives me certain rights." "Rights," Stigr interrupted, "that exist only as long as the community chooses to acknowledge them. Tell me, Erik, if you ordered the village to choose between following you or following me, how confident are you about the outcome?" The question hung in the air like a blade poised to fall. Erik realized with growing horror that he had maneuvered himself into a confrontation he could not win, against a man whose support he desperately needed but could never truly command. Meanwhile, 3 cottages away, Ragna was receiving visitors who brought news that complicated their departure plans in ways she hadn't anticipated. Astrid had arrived first, offering her services as a healer for the dangerous journey ahead. Bjorn had followed shortly after, bringing a pack horse and supplies he claimed the village could spare. Now, as the evening deepened, others continued to arrive. People who had heard fragments of truth mixed with wild speculation and had drawn their own conclusions about what was happening. "We know you're leaving," said Henrik the fisherman, speaking for the small group that had gathered in Ragna's cottage, "and we know it has something to do with Eric's festival restrictions and Stigr's challenge to his authority." Ragna looked around at the concerned faces villagers who had become friends over the past weeks, people who had found in her cottage a sense of community they'd been missing elsewhere. "It's more complicated than village politics," she said carefully. "It always is," replied Marta, the elderly woman whose sharp eyes missed very little. "But the simple version is that you need help, and Eric doesn't want you to get it. That's enough for us to understand which side we're on." Astrid stepped forward, her healer's bag slung across her shoulder and her expression resolute. "I'm going with you. Whatever dangers you're facing, you'll need someone with medical skills. And you'll need someone who knows the mountain passes," added Bjorn. "I've traded in Magnus Thorson's territory many times over the years. I know which routes are safest and which villages can be trusted for supplies." Ragna felt tears gathering in her eyes as she realized what was happening. These people, who barely knew her true identity, were offering to risk their own safety based on nothing more than friendship and their sense of what was right. "You don't understand what you're proposing," she said gently. "This journey involves dangers that go far beyond anything you've experienced. There are political forces at work that could—" "Could what?" Henrik interrupted. "Threaten our lives? Make us outcasts in our own village? Eric's been doing that to us gradually for years. At least this way, we're choosing to stand for something worthwhile." As if summoned by the mention of his name, heavy footsteps approached the cottage, followed by an authoritative knock that had everyone inside exchanging nervous glances. Ragna opened the door to find Eric standing on her threshold, flanked by two younger men she recognized as his most loyal supporters. "Ragna Torsdotter," Eric said, his voice carrying the formal tone he used for official pronouncements. "I need to speak with you about your planned departure from Fjellgard." The use of her full name, spoken with particular emphasis, sent a chill through everyone present. Eric's eyes swept the cottage, taking in the gathered villagers with the calculating gaze of someone cataloguing potential opposition. "These good people were just leaving," he continued, though it was clearly more command than observation. "We have private matters to discuss." But instead of the immediate compliance Eric expected, the villagers remained seated, their expressions ranging from suspicious to openly hostile. Astrid was the first to speak. "Actually, we were discussing travel preparations, nothing private about helping a friend get safely to her destination." Eric's jaw tightened. "Her destination being the territory of Jarl Magnus Thorson, if my information is correct. A territory currently experiencing significant political instability due to the Jarl's failing health." The pointed nature of his comment confirmed what Ragna had feared. Eric knew more about her identity and situation than he was directly admitting, but not enough to understand the full implications of opposing her. "My destination is my own business," Ragna replied with a dignity that reminded everyone present why she had always seemed different from other villagers. "As is my choice of traveling companions. Not when that choice involves taking Stigr away from his responsibilities here," Eric replied. "Not when it threatens the stability of our community during harvest season." Bjorn rose from his chair, his smith's shoulders squaring for a different kind of confrontation than he usually faced. "Stigr's been protecting this village for 10 years without asking for anything in return. If he chooses to escort an elderly woman on a family visit, that's hardly abandoning his responsibilities." "Family visit." Eric's smile was thin and cold. "Is that what we're calling it?" The tension in the small cottage had grown thick enough to taste. Ragna realized that Eric was probing, testing how much they knew about her true identity, while revealing how much he had discovered about theirs. It was a dangerous game, and one that could turn deadly if the wrong words were spoken. "I think," she said carefully, "that this conversation might be better continued in the morning, when everyone has had time to consider their words more carefully." But Eric had committed himself too far to retreat gracefully. "I think this conversation needs to be resolved tonight, before certain mistakes become irreversible." It was Astrid who recognized the implicit threat in Eric's words and chose to meet it head-on. "Are you threatening us, Eric?" "I'm trying to prevent good people from making choices they'll regret," he replied. "Choices that could have consequences extending far beyond this village." As the confrontation escalated in Ragna's cottage, neither side could have predicted that their raised voices would carry far enough to reach Stigr's ears as he completed his own preparations for departure. The sound of Eric's authoritative tone, mixed with his friend's defensive responses, brought the warrior to an immediate understanding of how desperate his Jarl had become. Strapping his father's shield to his arm and taking up the long axe that had earned him his reputation, Stigr stepped out into the night with the grim certainty that tomorrow would bring the confrontation he had spent 10 years avoiding. The time for neutrality had passed, the time for choosing sides had arrived, and the strength of his father's shield would soon be tested in ways Ericsson the Bold could never have anticipated. The village bell had not rung for an emergency assembly in over 5 years, but its bronze voice carried across Fjellgard's morning air with an authority that brought people running from their cottages and workshops. Eric stood beside the bell-post in the village square, his hand still gripping the rope, his face set in the hard lines of a man who had decided that desperate times called for desperate measures. By the time Stigr arrived, drawn by the urgent summons like every other villager, nearly the entire population of Fjellgard had gathered in the square. Men set down their tools, women left their cooking fires, children abandoned their games, all drawn together by the bronze call that traditionally announced matters of life and death. "People of Fjellgard," Eric began, his voice carrying the formal cadence reserved for official proclamations, "I have called this assembly to address a threat to our community's stability and security." A murmur ran through the crowd as neighbors exchanged glances. Wondering what crisis could have prompted such dramatic action, Stigr positioned himself near the back of the gathering, his pale eyes fixed on Eric with the intense focus of a hunter watching potentially dangerous prey. "For 10 years," Eric continued, "we have enjoyed peace and prosperity under stable leadership that has prioritized the welfare of our most productive and loyal citizens. That stability is now threatened by forces that would divide our community and undermine the very foundations of our success." From where he stood, Stigr could see Ragna near the front of the crowd, flanked by Astrid and Bjorn. Her face showed no fear, only the quiet dignity of someone who had weathered storms before and trusted in her ability to weather them again. "Last night," Eric's voice rose to ensure every villager could hear him clearly, "I discovered a conspiracy among us. Certain individuals, including some you trust and respect, have been planning actions that would expose our village to political dangers you cannot imagine." The crowd's murmur grew louder, worry mixing with curiosity as people tried to understand what Eric was describing. Several villagers looked toward Stigr, wondering if this somehow involved the warrior whose recent behavior had already become a source of speculation. Eric raised his hand for silence before continuing. "Stigr Eriksson, whom you know as our protector, has been manipulated by foreign agents into abandoning his duties to this community. At this very moment, he plans to escort certain individuals out of our territory, carrying with them secrets that could bring war to our peaceful village." The accusation hit the crowd like a physical blow. Conversations erupted as people struggled to process the idea that their legendary protector could be involved in anything treasonous. Stigr felt the weight of hundreds of eyes turning toward him, some confused, others accusatory, a few showing the fear that had always been his constant companion. "That's enough, Eric." Stigr's voice carried across the square with the same authority that had once silenced battlefield chaos. The crowd fell quiet immediately, recognizing the tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed in matters of life and death. "If you have accusations to make against me, make them plainly," Stigr continued, stepping forward through the crowd that parted automatically before him. "Don't hide behind vague references to conspiracies and foreign agents." Eric's confidence flickered as he faced the man whose support had been the invisible foundation of his authority for years. But he had gone too far to retreat now, committed himself to a confrontation that would end with either Stigr's submission or his own political destruction. "Very well," Eric said, his voice gaining strength from desperation. "You plan to escort Ragna Torsdottir to the Eastern Territories, despite my direct orders that you remain here during Harvest Festival. You're willing to abandon your obligations to this village for the sake of an elderly woman whose true identity and motivations you clearly don't understand." The crowd's attention shifted between the two men like spectators at a deadly game, sensing that something momentous was unfolding, but not yet understanding its full significance. "You're right that I plan to escort Ragna to the Eastern Territories," Stigr replied, his voice carrying easily across the square. "You're wrong about everything else." He turned slightly, addressing the crowd rather than Eric directly. 3 weeks ago, many of you watched me buy bread for a hungry woman on her birthday. Some of you laughed, some of you whispered about weakness and foolishness, but some of you remembered what community actually means. A few faces in the crowd showed recognition, recalling the scene at Gunnar's bakery that had started everything. Since then, I've learned that the woman I helped, a woman Eric would exclude from tomorrow's Harvest Festival because she lacks sufficient wealth and status, has spent her entire life in this village. She nursed sick children, including some of yours. She took in sewing work to help families who couldn't afford new clothes. She and her late husband contributed more to this community's welfare than most of us ever will. Stigr's gaze swept across the assembled villagers, seeing understanding begin to dawn in their expressions. And now, when she needs help traveling to visit her dying brother, Eric forbids anyone to assist her because helping her somehow threatens our village's stability. Stigr's voice carried an edge of contempt that made Eric flinch visibly. "Tell me, people of Fjellgard, what kind of stability requires us to abandon our neighbors in their time of need?" The crown ring had arrived that morning with a messenger who rode hard from the Eastern Territories, bearing word that would transform everything the villagers thought they understood about their situation. Ragna held the simple gold band in her palm now, its surface worn smooth by generations of noble hands, as she stepped forward to address the crowd that had gathered to judge her fate. "Before this goes any further," she said, her voice carrying the unmistakable authority of someone born to command, "there are things you need to know about who I am and why Eric fears my departure so greatly." The crowd fell silent, sensing that whatever revelation was coming would reshape their understanding of the morning's events. Eric's face had gone pale as he recognized the ring and understood its implications. "My name is Ragna Torsdottir," she continued, raising the crown ring so that its gold caught the morning light. "I am the sister of Jarl Magnus Thorson, ruler of the Eastern Territories and one of the most powerful nobles in Norway." The silence that followed was so complete that birds could be heard calling from the nearby forest. Villagers stared at the elderly woman they had known as a poor widow, struggling to reconcile her humble circumstances with the significance of what she was revealing. 25 years ago, I chose love over duty and married Tor the carpenter instead of the nobleman my family had selected for me. For that choice, I was disowned and cast out, forbidden to use my family name or claim any part of my inheritance. Stigr watched the crowd's faces as understanding began to dawn. The woman Eric had systematically excluded from village life, the person he had deemed unworthy of community support, was nobility of the highest rank. 3 days ago, Ragna continued, I received word that my brother is dying and wishes to reconcile before his death. This ring arrived this morning as proof of his sincerity and symbol of his intention to restore my inheritance, an inheritance that includes authority over dozens of villages and thousands of people. Eric finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a croak. "You can't prove." "I can prove everything," Ragna interrupted, her tone carrying the snap of someone accustomed to being obeyed, "including the fact that for 3 years you have treated the sister of Jarl Magnus Thorson like a beggar, excluding her from community celebrations and denying her the basic respect due to any village resident." The crowd's murmur grew into active conversation as people realized the magnitude of Eric's miscalculation. To mistreat any villager was poor leadership, but to systematically abuse someone connected to regional nobility was political suicide. More importantly, Stigr added, his voice cutting through the crowd's chatter, it shows exactly what Eric thinks of loyalty, community, and the obligations we owe each other. He didn't exclude Ragna because she lacked noble blood. He excluded her because she lacked immediate utility to his power. Bjorn stepped forward from where he had been standing with the other village elders. "If what you're saying is true, Lady Ragna, then Eric's treatment of you could bring consequences none of us are prepared to face, which is exactly why he's trying to prevent her departure." Astrid added, "He knows that once she reaches her brother's territory, word will spread about how Fjellgard's Jarl treats noble guests." Eric's desperation finally boiled over into open panic. "She's been deceiving all of you, living among us under false pretenses, gathering information, manipulating our protector into abandoning his duties. I've been living among you as the woman I chose to become," Ragna replied with quiet dignity. "Working with my hands, caring for my neighbors, contributing what I could to community welfare, exactly as I did when I was married to Tori. My birth doesn't change the value of that work or the sincerity of my friendships." The crowd was beginning to take sides, with lines forming between those who supported Eric's traditional authority and those who were drawn to Ragna's vision of community based on mutual care rather than rigid hierarchy. "The question before you," Stigr said, addressing the entire assembly, "is simple. What kind of village do you want Fjellgard to be? One that protects and honors its most vulnerable members, or one that discards people the moment they can no longer serve those in power?" Old Henrik raised his voice from the crowd. "I've lived here 70 years, and I remember when harvest festivals welcomed everyone who called Fjellgard home. When did we start deciding that some neighbors matter less than others?" "When we started letting fear guide our choices instead of honor," replied Marta, her ancient voice carrying clearly across the square. "When we forgot that community strength comes from including people, not excluding them." Eric made one final attempt to salvage his authority. "If you support this madness, if you allow Stigr to abandon his post for the sake of political intrigue, you'll be responsible for whatever consequences follow." But his words fell on increasingly unsympathetic ears. The village had heard enough to understand that their choice was between a leader who ruled through fear and manipulation and the possibility of something better. The crown ring in Ragna's palm caught the sunlight like a promise that change was not only possible, but inevitable. The new community charter lay spread across the table in what had once been Eric's hall, its fresh parchment bearing the careful script of Astrid the healer, who had volunteered to record the village's collective decisions. 6 months had passed since that morning when the bell had called Fjellgard to choose its future, and the document before them represented everything that had changed in the wake of that choice. Stigr read through the provisions one final time, his weathered finger-tracing lines that established protections for the elderly, support systems for widows and widowers, and guarantees that no villager would be excluded from community celebrations based on their ability to pay arbitrary fees. It was everything his mother would have wanted to see written into law. Everything his father had died believing was already protected by honor and custom. "Article 7 still feels the most important to me," Ragna said, settling into her chair across from him. The journey to her brother's deathbed had transformed more than just her legal status. It had given her a voice in Fjellgard's governance that she wielded with the wisdom of someone who had lived both as nobility and as a Forgotten widow. Stigr smiled as he read the article she referenced. The strength of a community shall be measured not by the prosperity of its most fortunate members, but by the care and respect shown to its most vulnerable. The words had been his suggestion, but they reflected conversations that had begun in this very cottage months before, when a simple request for birthday bread had started unraveling the careful cruelties that had been poisoning their village. "Your brother would have approved," he said, remembering the dying Jarl who had spent his final weeks rewriting his own territorial laws based on the changes taking place in tiny Fjellgard. Magnus Thorson had died, believing that his sister's exile had taught her lessons about leadership that all his formal education had failed to provide. The sound of approaching footsteps drew their attention to the window, where they could see Bjorn leading a small delegation toward the hall. The blacksmith had accepted the role of village elder with characteristic reluctance, claiming he was better suited to shaping iron than governing people. But his steady judgment had proven invaluable during the transition period. "Time for the weekly reports," Ragna observed, rising to welcome their visitors. The practice of regular community meetings had been one of their first innovations, replacing Eric's autocratic decisions with a system that valued collective wisdom over individual authority. Astrid entered first, her healer's bag supplemented now by the ledgers that tracked the village's new support programs. "The Widow's Assistance Fund is working better than we hoped," she reported, settling into her usual seat. "3 families have been able to maintain their homes through the winter, and 2 of the older women have found meaningful work helping with the younger children." Henrik followed, moving slowly but with the dignity of someone who had rediscovered his value to the community. At 73, he had become the village's unofficial historian, documenting traditions and customs that risked being lost as older generations passed away. "The festival planning is coming along well," he said, accepting the cup of tea Ragna offered. "Young Helga has some excellent ideas about honoring the craftspeople whose work keeps us all comfortable. And her wedding dress turned out beautifully. Her grandmother would have been proud." The mention of the dress brought smiles to everyone present. Helga's wedding had become the first major celebration under their new community guidelines, demonstrating that inclusivity could enhance rather than diminish the joy of shared traditions. "What about the territorial relationships?" Stigr asked, turning to Bjorn. "Any word from the regional council?" The blacksmith's expression grew serious. "Mixed news. The other Jarls are still adjusting to Ragna's restoration to nobility, but Magnus's final recommendations are carrying weight. 3 villages have requested copies of our charter to study for their own communities." "And Eric?" Ragna asked quietly. "Still in exile, last anyone heard. Some say he's found work as a clerk in the southern settlements, others that he's joined a merchant company heading overseas." Bjorn shrugged. "Either way, he's learned that authority without legitimacy has a short lifespan." The afternoon light streaming through the hall's windows caught the charter's carefully drawn letters, illuminating words that had been written with hope, but tested by the practical challenges of governance. Not everything had gone smoothly in the months since Eric's departure. There had been disagreements about resource allocation, debates over traditional practices that conflicted with their new values, moments when the easier path of autocratic decision-making had seemed appealing. But they had persevered, learning that sustainable change required patience, compromise, and the daily choice to honor their stated principles even when it was inconvenient. "I've been thinking about my mother a lot lately," Stigr said as the meeting wound down and the others prepared to return to their evening routines. Wondering what she would think of how everything turned out, Ragna reached across the table to touch his hand, a gesture that had become as natural as breathing over the months they had worked together to rebuild their community's foundation. "I think she would say, you finally learned the difference between strength that protects and strength that isolates." As the sun set over Fjellgard, painting the fjords in shades of gold and crimson. The village settled into the rhythms of a community that had chosen compassion over convenience, inclusion over exclusion. Children played in streets where elderly neighbors watched over them with genuine affection. Widows and widowers found companionship in shared meals and collaborative projects. Craftspeople discovered that their skills were valued not just for their economic utility, but for their contribution to the village's cultural richness. The harvest festival that year had been the largest in living memory, with neighboring villages sending delegations to observe the celebrations that had become legendary throughout the region for their spirit of radical hospitality. But perhaps the most meaningful change was visible in the small moments that occurred every day, moments when people chose kindness over indifference, when communities chose to measure their success by how well they cared for everyone within their boundaries. Standing in the cottage where it had all begun, Stigr and Ragna could see the lights beginning to flicker on in windows throughout Fjellgard. Behind each light was a family that had learned to live by the simple truth that a community's greatest strength lay not in the fear it could inspire, but in the hope it could nurture. The threads of fate, as Stigr's mother had once said, were indeed woven by individual choices. And the pattern they had created was beautiful beyond anything any of them had dared to imagine.